Okay, you're back.
I am sorry about that. I don't know what's going on.
No, it's okay. So listen, let's go back to
Hmm.
Freud, and I'm going to just stick to these questions, and
Hmm.
we'll go through them. So, my first question I wrote down as I was reading your essay is this: was Freud's understanding of drives and the operations of the psyche, uh, which was divided into id, ego, and superego, was that understanding transhistorical?
I think that in his own mind, it's kind of an interesting problem because he would tie it to society or civilization,
Mm-hmm.
in which case it's not transhistorical,
Mm-hmm.
but the historical scale and scope of the proposition is different from the way Adorno and other people in the Frankfurt School, like Marcuse, thought of it, because their perspective was that the idea of a contradictory mental process is a phenomenon of capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that there's a reason why no one before the 19th century ever thought of such a thing, they would say. Right. And so for Freud, it's like, I don't know, a 200,000 year proposition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not even civilization in the sense of the Neolithic Revolution, but culture itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? So long as humans lived in culture, so long as they tamed their instinctual needs through cultural forms, then this would potentially be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whereas for the Frankfurt School, for a kind of a Marxist perspective, the specific way that he's conceiving it would be a phenomenon of capitalism of the late 19th century, or at least of the 19th century. So perhaps the discovery is coming rather late. Maybe the actual phenomenon, of course, predates Freud's observation of it. Um, so, now transhistorical is one of these funny things, right? Because you could say everything that is historically specific nonetheless has a deeper history to it, right? And so one wouldn't necessarily have to choose between Freud's account and a Marxist account, exactly. But one could say, that if you think that this problem is, millennia old, then that's going to give you a different sense of how it might be overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And especially because, within Freud's own lifetime, in fact, but certainly after Freud, suddenly things start to look different from how he observed. The
Mm-hmm.
classic hysterias are replaced by more pre-Oedipal and narcissistic disorders. Again, not in the DSM kind of definition of narcissism, but in the Freudian sense of, he thought melancholia could not really be treated by the talking cure,
Mm.
for example, right? So it's kind of a threshold case. Some could and some couldn't, right?
That's interesting. So I'm going to follow up on melancholia because my understanding of melancholia is when you refuse to mourn,
Mm-hmm.
you have a loss, say, and then you refuse to mourn and instead hold on to a fantasy of uh, redemption or return. So, like, if someone you in love dies, and you refuse to accept and properly mourn their passing, but hold on to unconsciously a fantasy of their resurrection, you might suffer from melancholia, this perpetual sense of loss that can't be integrated.
It's not exactly a refusal, it's an incapability.
Yeah, you cannot let go of the fantasy you of
Well, the issue there is that there isn't enough of a you there. In other words, it's not a matter of you letting go. It's a matter of how much you were invested to begin with, and the way you were invested. In other words, what it reveals is that the other was always a narcissistic object, and not an actual object.
Oh,
And so
okay.
the reason you can't let go is because it feels like to let go of the other would mean to cease to exist oneself.
Okay, that's very interesting.
So it's
And
and so you can't. It's what we would now call depression.
right.
Is what Freud called melancholia, although again the way we would define depression clinically now would not be exactly the same as the way he defined it clinically. But why depressed people suffer insomnia in a way that someone in mourning might not.
Right.
Being sad is different from being depressed, because being sad is about the object, being depressed is about yourself.
Right. So so in the 19th century and in Freud's time in the early 20th century, people were more secure in themselves and therefore less likely to retreat into narcissism. But that so the paradoxical thing, and I've read about this in Lash particularly, is that in this book, The Culture of Narcissism, is that narcissism and self-obsession is actually a symptom of a lack of connection to the self. Yeah,
lack of self. So in other words, absence of an object, including oneself as an object. So right. It's an absence of ego libido as well as of object libido. Right. That's why it's more of a identification with the other, identification with the object, such that its loss is your annihilation. I mean, by the way, this is why Klein comes in when she does historically, because these are the prevailing pathologies we deal with. Right. Say a little bit more about that. Like Klein had this object-oriented approach to psychoanalysis, where it was a matter of the good breast and the bad breast, and ambivalence. Right. So the thing is, we're supposed to have resolved our ambivalence, at least largely, through the Oedipus complex. And so, in other words, we kind of hive off the ego ideal and the object ideal, and we kind of resolve our kind of ideation of the ego and of the object. And, we love some things and we hate other things, right? Whereas pre-Oedipal, we kind of love and hate everything, including ourselves, or including our own, drives, or, in other words, it's really a lack of a ego. The other Lash phrase is the minimal self.
Right. Which is another book. It was a follow-up to The Culture of Narcissism.
That's what he's trying to capture there. And so, we could just say bourgeois subjectivity, right? The ego, the I, by the way. So those Latin words are introduced into the English translation. So it's the I and the it. And so it's taking oneself, it's being a subject, but taking oneself as an object, and regarding your own psychology as objective. So that's the unconscious. We confront that our own mental process is objective to us.
Yeah. So hold on one second. I'm gonna blow my nose. Yeah. I'm sure that was a defense mechanism. I didn't really have to blow my nose.
I've had a cold too.
Yeah. Well, you have your own defense mechanism that you're working.
I've had a cold the last few days, and today I was going to take Dayquil so I could be good on this call. But then I didn't need to.
Well,
because talking to Doug about Freud, it just cures.
Oh, that's wonderful. I am the new talking cure. So, all right. So I was going to ask how Adorno demonstrated the historical character of Freud's model of the psyche and its relationship to capital. And one of the answers that you've already sort of provided was that during Adorno's lifetime, the kind of symptoms that were being exhibited and the kind of psyche that lay below them changed due to the historical conditions after World War II, particularly, maybe?
After World War I.
After World War I, okay. So,
by the way, I'll make a plug for one thing. Marcuse has a wonderful essay called "The Obsolescence of the Freudian Concept of Man." It's excellent.
Okay, and
Right.
What does he say there?
That Freud expresses not only a past that has been lost, but a future to be regained.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, there are similar thought figures in Adorno as well. In other words, that Freud becomes utopian the way Kant becomes utopian, right? And I think that a lot of leftists dismiss Kant as like bourgeois utopianism, bourgeois idealism, right?
Mm-hmm.
The categorical imperative. Like, no, there's material interests. It's like, come on, man. No, there's the categorical imperative is real. And so similarly, the Lacanians are like, the non-existence of the subject, or, the illusion of the ego and the passion of the real. You suffer from the desire for reality that doesn't exist. Well, what about the reality principle then? That just gets tossed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's like, no, right? Don't we want to attain to that? Bourgeois rationality, reality testing, ego.
I would just point something out off to the side of what you just said around Lacan and all that. I think the Zizek and the Lacanians have to be understood as a step back towards the Enlightenment, away from the post-structuralists. Whether or not they make enough of a journey is one thing, but they're certainly not trying to, like, you will hear Zizek say, why don't we defend Descartes? Everyone is against Descartes. Why are we so sure that we need to abandon the Cartesian subject? And that's, Zizek, who also will say, I'm not a humanist, and I was
going to say, Zizek will just say provocations. In other words, he just looks at the fact that everyone's anti-Cartesian, and he's like, oh, well, then there must be something good about Descartes.
Well, he says more than just what I said. He has reasons for defending Descartes.
No, and that's fine. But, in some ways I'd want to defend Lacan against the Lacanians, but now you're making it seem like maybe I want to salvage the Lacanians against Lacan. And, and obviously Lacan is like a dissident in his own milieu and, this kind of, I don't know, I guess what appeared to him to be a hyper-rationalist, like French university dominated by the Communist Party intellectuals. And, Foucault is different from Lacan, but Foucault is also like rejecting Marx and Freud as like these arch rationalists and very repressive, right? And I just feel like they're, yes, people are going to grope their way back to reason. They are, insofar as they are reasonable. And I just feel like we can cut to the chase, we can be clear. And again, I think that Freud is a lot clearer. I think the stakes of Lacan are not clear. And, or insofar as they are clear, then they appear to be abandoning the Marxist project.
Well, as I said earlier in the first part where the internet wasn't so good, this is much better, by the way. There's a split in psychoanalysis between the clinicians and the academics. And the clinicians, when they look to Lacan, they're not too pleased.
No
track record as a clinician.
Right.
This is a guy who
nor should they be
slept with a few of his patients. I think, I don't know. Maybe I don't mean to impugn him on rumor alone, but he was not.
I heard he was an incel.
Oh, really? Who told you that?
I don't know. The Twitter sphere, the dark side of the internet. I don't know. In a dream. Someone said, "Look, I was an incel," and I'm like, "Well, that would make sense." I don't know.
I don't believe that is the case. No,
okay.
I don't believe that's right.
Well, I hope he wasn't.
No, he was not an incel for sure. He definitely.
I hope no one is.
I think he married, a couple of different, I don't know. The point is that that the clinicians would judge Lacan differently than the academics, and we should ask ourselves, I think, to what kind of clinical outcomes, people who want to create a project for socialism would be seeking. And I don't think creating a bunch of Judith Butlers would be the best outcome for clinical practice. In other words, people who can't.
There are certainly worse possibilities.
Well, sure, but when I say creating a bunch of Judith Butlers, I just mean people who, can't land anywhere clearly enough to launch a critique that isn't simply the sort of ultimately going to turn into a justification for.
So can I tell you what my deal is? You know, in case your viewers want to know what my deal is.
Yeah, what is your fucking deal, Chris?
Man, what's the deal, man? My deal is, can we have a socialist intelligentsia?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And, maybe then we might find some use for Marxism. I mean, obviously we need a working class movement too.
Mm-hmm.
But we also need a socialist intelligentsia. We do.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, certainly the Platypus Project has been about removing the obstacles to a socialist intelligentsia.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that what you have is like 1,000,001 reasons not to be a socialist intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't want to impose your will on the working class, or I don't know what. People just have all sorts of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
All sorts of hang-ups. And I'm like, look, there are worse things that can happen to the working class than to have the socialist intelligentsia come along.
Right.
These days.
Yeah.
Right. And the problem with the socialist intelligentsia these days is that they want to just, that's the circular firing squad. It's among the intellectuals, right? And so when I think of Judith Butler, I just think of someone who's going to tell you, you're not going to lead the revolution and you shouldn't want to.
Right.
And I'm like, well, then what should I want to do? Just fucking like stare at Foucault for the rest of my life? I mean, and just sort of self-flagellate.
You should want to go for a walk with your friend who's in a wheelchair. That's what you should want, which is a fine thing to do. But you should want to. But you should want to insist that they are walking.
Oh,
that this is their walk, rather than say, "Oh yeah, you're rolling."
But that's my deal. My deal is, I'm against everything that's going to convince people not to be socialist intellectuals.
Right.
And not to commit to the long-term political project of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Back to the questions. You wrote that Freud can be taken as an alternative to Marx or Kant only to the degree to which a Marxian approach fails to give adequate expression to historical developments in the self-contradiction of subjectivity of the commodity form. If Freud's theory was transhistorical, are we in danger of a conflation if we claim that Marx's account of the self-contradiction of the subjectivity of the commodity form maps onto Freud's model of the psyche? So there.
Well, I mean, right. So, I mean, obviously that's a complex proposition because I would say that what is the subjectivity of the commodity form? It's the working class. Much more so than it's the capitalist class. Actually, the capitalist class has long ago abandoned the commodity form.
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, marginal utility theory, bourgeois economics has...
They've abandoned it in thought.
Yeah, they've abandoned the labor theory of value. In other words, if they tell the working class to, adopt the work ethic, they do so self-consciously, cynically. In other words, they're just like, yeah, that's what the proles need to hear. Mm-hmm. But meanwhile, I'm in my post-human dystopian
information economy.
Right, or whatever, or it's like, we're just like memeing, or we're in the free play of the signifier. Right. And we know that it's just the free play of the signifier, but the proles need to think that work means something and is worth something. Right. So the only people who really believe in
they all think that until the electricity goes out and their plumbing backs up, or there's no food on the shelves at the grocery.
What do you mean, the capitalist bourgeoisie? No, they've got their Zen Buddhism waiting to take care of that eventuality.
Yeah,
mindfulness. They can be like, look, don't panic, be mindful.
Yeah. Well, there's a limit to how far that can take you.
I hope, but don't discount the inhumanity of the bourgeoisie. I mean, they spend their whole lives screwing themselves up to this point of like being able to deal with whatever,
Yeah.
You saw Don't Look Up, right?
Yeah. What did you think of Don't Look Up?
yeah, it's whatever, right? It was kind of amusing. And, it's kind of like, I mean, it's a kind of a nasty kind of pleasure or something, watching Meryl Streep get eaten by the alien dinosaur as Eve. All the naked billionaires, getting gobbled up by the dinosaurs on the planet. It's like, okay, we hate the capitalists. Okay, yeah.
Who I really hated in that movie was not those people who seemed to me like, kind of idiot.
Naive, just what they are, right?
Yeah. But the scientists who failed so spectacularly to overcome the problem and seemed to go out of their way to fail. I mean, they just...
You're supposed to hate them because you're supposed to identify with them.
Right. I did identify with them, and I hated them at the same time.
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah. Yeah, and the woman from the Hunger Games.
It's Jennifer Lawrence. It is Jennifer.
Yeah, I think it's Jennifer Lawrence.
And then they're having like a dinner together when the world is ending.
Yeah.
Like very, very like Brooklyn or wherever. Very like, Portland, right?
Yeah, we're all together and we're just gonna, we meet, our community here is what gives us meaning even at the very end, which is okay and everything. But they could have done a good job to stop the meteor from hitting. They could have not. What they did is embody their impotence and use it as a moral shield to fail in order to justify their failure.
Judith Butler.
Yeah. It's just, why aren't you people scared? Why aren't you, it's like, well, how about you present something where they can get something out of the other side, survive. Their message was, we're all going to die. Not, we need to stop this meteor. And here's my plan. And the only person that came up with a plan to stop the meteor was depicted as a psychopath and an idiot. So
and I love the fact that Meryl Streep is the combination of Hillary and Trump.
Right.
I love that. And I love how the guy is a combination of Steve Jobs and Elon Musk.
Right.
Or something.
Or Bezos and Musk.
Jeff Bezos, sure. That he's kind of dark, like an Elon Musk, but also doofy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He reminded me of the guy who led Heaven's Gate. But there's another show I want to bring up at this point, which is called, I think it's called Severance, and it's about
that I have not seen.
It's on Apple TV, and my kids showed it to me when I went to Springfield and Eugene. We binged it. It's made by Ben Stiller, just the director of it, but it's a science fiction show, and the premise is
I've actually heard of this. Okay.
Yeah. The premise is that you get an implant in your brain so that when you're at work, you don't remember who you were when you're not at work. You just start fresh on your first day. You don't know your name. You don't know what state you're in. You don't remember your parents. You have no memories of your past. You do have enough of working memory to know what the 50 states are and how to speak and what things are. Yeah, you can function, but you don't have a personal memory. But then once you start at work, you do accumulate memories of your work self. And so you become split. There's an outie you. So as soon as you leave work, you remember all your personal life, but you don't remember what you did at work. You have no memory of work. And that's the benefit for people, right? I can go to work, turn my brain off, and immediately I'm done with work and I'm leaving, and I don't have to think about what I'm doing. And so that's the premise of this show, is that we have our work selves, which are, by the way, much more naive. And much easier to manipulate.
Yeah.
Than the outer selves and the selves that can go to the grocery store. And they're compliant, although that breaks down over time. That doesn't stay.
Of course, right. So the thing is, right, of course, the point of the show would be to,
to outline how these people organize. One of the things that they do is they keep the departments split off from each other so they can't organize together.
But this is romantic.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This is romantic. This is 1844 manuscripts, right?
Yeah. How so?
Well, that we're dehumanized at work, but that's the only place where we can be human, because in our leisure time, we're only able to take pleasure in our animal selves. Like all of that stuff, which is, supposed to be dialectical.
Mm-hmm.
It's not supposed to be like, I mean, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Which is, I would say, and obviously this is different than the conscious and the unconscious. This is a different kind of split, right? That socialism would be the completion of that split, but also the reintegration.
Right.
Right. And the reason that I say that is, I've raised Marcuse, and one of the beefs between Marcuse and Adorno is about, can work become play?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the question of a play instinct, play drive, like Friedrich Schiller, and a work instinct or a work drive, which Marcuse offers as a possibility in a way that Adorno objects to. And, because actually Marcuse is already seeing in the 60s the possibility of a post-work society as dystopian. Right. And so
almost everyone who wrote about a post-work society in the 60s saw it as dystopian.
Right. Right. And, so he's trying to salvage, in a way that's rather unfortunate, kind of hypostasize a kind of a bourgeois kind of subject as worker.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, I would just say we can't know what the relationship between work and play is going to be. And also it's not, obviously there's a great deal of play in work already. And also there's a great deal of like play in work, right? So it's
one of the things that's interesting at this show Severance is that when we follow the main character out of the workday, because we only start with him at work and then he leaves, right? We discover that what he does after work is go home, drink heavily, and watch TV. He doesn't.
Everybody does. Right.
He doesn't do anything. He isn't liberated in any way by having his work life split off from him. And what is he doing? He's mourning the loss of his wife who died. So failing to mourn. Yeah. He's in a state of melancholia. But
at least he can work.
Right? He can work now.
Yeah. So this is what allows him to work. The severance.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he couldn't keep. He was a teacher, but he couldn't keep doing it.
This is This is a pretty nice premise.
Yeah, it's an interesting premise. I think
it's a great premise because it basically is like, yeah, you're going to get the mental health help that you need only insofar as you can work.
Right.
And and also because that's what we want, right? In other words, like not simply because the capitalists need us to work, but because we define our own minimum functionality as work. Can we work?
Right. Yeah, that's right. And so it's an interesting show, and I do think that, and also the aim of the show is for the characters. First of all, it's interesting. The characters at work are the much more interesting characters than the people when they're out in the world, for me anyway, because they're working. They're
dealing with things.
Yeah, they're dealing with the reality. They have to confront one of the things they have to try to figure out is what is their work about? Because no one really knows what they're working on.
Oh, okay.
They sit at computers and they do jobs that don't make any sense to them.
It's a little bit of a romantic notion of like the division of labor or something, or
right. Yeah, like a very literal version of the division of labor. No department knows what the other department does, and you're doing something that doesn't make any sense to you in the immediate sense, but what you get paid for and what you have to do.
It's really still 1844 manuscripts. The worker is alienated from the product of his labor, and of course Marx didn't mean by that like the physical object, the article of consumption, but rather capital. Like you're alienated from the social result of your labor.
Well, and they are entirely alienated from the social result.
But they're concretizing it, right? Because they're turning it into like the actual purpose of the work.
Actually, the purpose of the work is to create the working class that's like this. That's really
okay. So it
right.
turns out this
The real product being produced there is the staff and not the things that they're making. It's
okay.
The experiment in severance, really. It's like, I think that's my theory anyway. But
you haven't gotten.
I bring this all up because only to say, like, I feel as though at times that you can find in the world of entertainment and certainly in books that we're all still working on this problem.
Right.
People
know that there's this problem, capitalism. They do.
Right.
In a myriad of ways, right? So concretely, it appears in all sorts of ways. And, this is why we can't get too hung up on any like past historical concrete manifestations of like class struggle or working class organizing, because who knows what that might look like actually now in an adequate way to mobilize people. But that would have to be discovered, figured out actually. And so it can't be a priori judged based on past politics that's been left behind by capitalism anyway. But it's a funny thing, because on the one hand there's that, and on the other hand there is the need for a sense of the historical trajectory of capitalism, where it came from and where it is and where it might go. And that still requires a kind of historical consciousness that then is always in danger of being trapped in the past. Right? And so it's kind of like you have to sort of keep things at the proper levels of abstraction and concretion. Everything's not the same or resolvable. One is always relating the concrete and the abstract in that sense.
So back to Adorno and Freud. I mean, to what extent did the split in the subject for Adorno, say, come down to these sort of the kind of the category of alienation that Marx might have talked about, or come down to the split that's happening through production? You said severance, as I described it, doesn't really map on to the unconscious. But what did Adorno think about the fact of the unconscious? Because it seems like, in a way, Adorno is hoping that we could excavate the unconscious and develop a true individuality and self-aware ego, and which would be like integrating the work self and the private self, in severance, I think. Right.
So there's, again, it's the Aufhebung, right?
Right.
The sublation, which is to say that one would want to fulfill the bourgeois subject of, the psychology of the ego, and also transcend and abolish, if you will, or negate, insofar as it's no longer necessary, right? So it needs to be fulfilled insofar as it's necessary, and it needs to be transcended insofar as its necessity is fulfilled, and therefore can be overcome. Now, that's going to look to us, and again, we're back in the kind of countercultural world. It's going to look to us as like kill your ego or something, ego death or whatever. It's going to look like, embracing the aspects of existing capitalist reality that negate our egos. And no, Adorno wouldn't go for that.
And we've already said at the beginning that we've already lost that our narcissism is a product of that.
That's right. That's right.
So if we want to be able to act in a selfless way, killing our ego isn't going to help do that.
No, right. And so, it's like the liquidation of the individual. This is the catchphrase of the Frankfurt School. And again, what does liquidation mean? It means it is a financial term, It means that its value has been translated from one form to another, but liquidated really without redemption. In other words, without its actual value being realized. And so it's not just about a kind of elimination, because even the Hegelian negation is not like just an annihilation.
Right.
Right. And so, again, the proposition here is tricky because what we have is a possibility of transcending capitalism that's manifesting in capitalism in a purely destructive way.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, I mean, the way that I like to put it is, I don't really believe in AI. I don't think it exists. I don't think that it really will exist exactly. Mm-hmm. But I forget, I was reading somewhere recently. Oh, no, you guys were actually saying this, you and Ashley.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about socialism being when things can do what humans have to do now.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, where humans no longer have to do. It's no longer necessary for humans to do what things could do, which doesn't mean that humans won't do those things, but it means that they won't have to. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, and we obviously live in a world where, I don't know, stock trading is done by computers on algorithms instead of an automated way, because that's actually a better way of realizing profits than actually humans making stock trading judgments, right? Because it's just gotten so fast. And actually, my high school boyfriend was in on the ground floor of developing that stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He, this is what getting a physics.
How is he doing these days?
Oh, he got money.
I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also retired early and was working as like a tech guy at a public high school.
No.
Just to work. But, he kind of, he took the money he made and
ran. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
and his team was blamed for the 2008 crash.
Well, that's ridiculous.
Right? Because their algorithms failed. And it's like, well, it's not like that. Like, that's not how capitalism is.
There was a time, I think in the 80s, where the computers were actually responsible for a momentary crash in the stock market.
Oh, sure, but that's different. That's a technical failure.
Right. And that was, but it was immediately corrected and overcome.
Fixed, right, exactly.
Yeah.
No, this idea was like, oh, these nerdy brainiacs and semi-autistic people like had convinced themselves that the economy could run on automation or something. And then, they got their comeuppance or something.
Well, obviously the economy wasn't running on automation.
Right. Right. It's running
otherwise there wouldn't be a stock market. I mean,
so it's running on a billions of decisions made by humans all the time.
Right. And billions of a lot of productive hours.
Oh yes.
But anyhow, back to this idea of overcoming. I guess here's one of the questions.
In other words, negating the ego, it's kind of like, well, what are we charging the ego with?
Right.
Right. And so, clearly science and technology, we can metabolize nature in a way and at a scale that is no longer the matter of like individual humans as bourgeois subjects.
Right.
We've left that behind a long time ago, where that's the essential mediating link, if you will. There always was, Rousseau did discover the general will that goes beyond the aggregate wills of the individuals anyway. Mm-hmm. Society is more than the sum of its parts. So that's already been there in bourgeois society. And you could argue, I guess, in human social relations all the time, insofar as we've had culture in society. But, now we can let the computers do shit. Why not? Right? Let the robots do shit. And so the problem is, the technology that we've developed under capitalism is not quite fit for the task. But in principle, it could be developed in such a way that it might be, serve a different purpose. And that, of course, keeping the robots running is dependent on labor as value still. Which it doesn't need to be and shouldn't be.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's the main thing. But back to this question of of psychoanalysis or psychology or mental health or overcoming our narcissism.
You said something about clinical outcomes earlier, right? Like, in other words,
I'm going back to that.
Outcomes that would be in keeping with the desire to change society in a emancipatory way, right?
Right.
In the direction of freedom. And, I don't think it quite lines up exactly, right? In other words, I don't think that, I think Freud's interested in individual autonomy and liberty.
And whether that makes them fit into society or not is not his concern.
That's right. It's not his concern. Now, in terms of collective freedom, he's interested in that. He's a good liberal, and he's even like sympathetic to socialism. He's surrounded by people. The Austrian Socialist Party is there. It's part of the milieu. He's skeptical about it, but he's sympathetic. So it's not like he doesn't care about that, but that's not his concern as a therapist. Changing society. It's not. In other words, he's willing to leave it at the level of it's society's problem. If strengthening the individual's autonomy is a liability, that's society's problem. It's not my right?
You said, I think I've heard you say, and I think I even got out of this essay that for the Platypus Affiliated Society, and maybe you didn't write this in the essay, but that the aim of the Marxist should be the same aim as the psychoanalyst. That we should approach changing in creating socialism from the psychoanalytic perspective of creating freedom,
self-awareness,
self-recognition, individuality, and you also point to right.
And then Omer Hussein also wrote an article about psychoanalysis in the left. And I don't think the platypus is trying to be the psychoanalyst of the left. It might cause moments of
Well, your seminars are often talking cures for leftists, in a way. They're kind of you're setting up.
They're talk shops. They're claptrap. Claptrap, talk shop. The Spartacists say.
No. Well, okay. That's not what I'm trying to charge you with.
They're a discharge of nervous energy.
Oh, yeah. They're cathartic, and then they can return to repetition. But right. When I've seen, from what I've seen and I've seen a number of seminars now that you've put together, there often will emerge a reframing of the problem that the left is dealing with through the exploration of the ways in which
that might be more Socratic than psychoanalytic.
Yeah.
It might be more basic than that. But in terms of like clinical outcomes and the struggle for socialism, I think that like Reich, who I invoke, was interested in the point of contact of ideology critique. In other words, the reason for the apparent unreason. And obviously, the reason for the apparent unreason in society and in politics is not the same as the reason for the apparent unreason of individual behavior.
Right. Only the individuals are the substance of society.
Yeah. They're agents, they're nodules.
I think you say that in your essay.
We want to I would say the goal of socialism is to give individuality its substance for the first time.
Right.
So we have individuality on a kind of a bourgeois substance, which was, a major emancipation in history, but is now a rather impoverished basis for our individuality. What we were talking about earlier. Can you show up to work? Is that the definition of health? Right.
Well, I mean, look, let me put it to you this way. If we think that everyone or most people in contemporary conditions of capitalism have been transformed from neurotics into narcissists, no longer displaying hysterical symptoms, but displaying symptoms of melancholia and depression and anxiety. And
which, to get back to the sign and the symptoms and the symbols, right? What it means is that you actually don't have objectifiable symptoms.
Say more about that. I mean,
like hysteria, the classic hysteria is literally like psychosomatic. It's literally like,
I can't move my arm.
Yeah, it's symbolization of the body, and then it's like associative, and then you trace the chain of associations mentally into the unconscious, and you find the motivation. The problem with these narcissistic issues is that they lack that kind of symbolization.
Right. So if we believe that's the case, and I think that it largely is, should part of, I mean, my instinct, my knee-jerk answer to my own question is no. So should socialists be aiming at transforming people back into, neurotic hysterics, away from narcissism? Do we have to address our narcissism as individuals even?
Yeah, it would be a step in the right direction, but of course that's not really possible, nor is it our remit. And so, another essay that I'll plug for is my critical authoritarianism essay, meaning that, and this is where Reich can be misunderstood as like, I don't know, we have to out-fascist the fascists or something.
I thought he always just said we need more orgasms. Everyone needs to.
That's later.
Okay,
That's later. I mean, that's when he's more sad, we might say. But, it's kind of like, oh, well, the Marxists neglected the subjective factor of history. Does that mean that they have to appeal to people's irrationality the way the fascists did? No, that's not what he meant, right? So, but there is the issue of critical authoritarianism, meaning how does authoritarianism point beyond itself? In other words, it certainly isn't about like anti-authoritarianism, right? So it's not about like haranguing people for being authoritarian or trying to self-criticize your own authoritarianism. No, we are authoritarian. Capitalism makes us authoritarian. The struggle for socialism is going to be authoritarian. It is like any politics in capitalism. It's going to share that aspect. To be aware of that, hopefully, means that we don't just succumb to it. But it also has to be on that basis that it becomes overcome. Right. And so the ego death in capitalism does give us some indication of the direction we have to go in. Meaning, and actually this brings us back to like structuralism and post-structuralism and whatnot. It's kind of like structural Marxism or something. It's like, there's a kernel of truth to it, which is to say we need to change society and we need to do what's necessary to get that process underway, which doesn't guarantee a good outcome, but you can think about ways that structurally we'd be compelled to continue along a certain path rather than relapse into capitalism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. You and I have talked about this, like, I don't know, time chits. In other words, the time chits are not the answer, but they might compel us to go beyond.
Right.
In a way that a money economy does not compel us to go beyond.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely think that's what Marx had in mind when he wrote about
Absolutely,
that.
Right. And so that's where it's kind of like structuralism. It's like, okay, so we do need this, I think I have told you about that there's a show, Travelers, on Netflix. It's a wonderful show. And what I love about it is that human liberation is being dictated by artificial intelligence.
Right. We've talked about Travelers. I think.
Yeah, we did talk about it. And so I was just like, if only I could take my understanding of Marxism and put it in an AI and have that AI like take over an army of humans to achieve socialism, that would be great. Do you know? Because
sounds like a narcissistic fantasy of omnipotence to me there, Chris. But yeah.
No, but I wouldn't be the AI. In other words, I want to be the meat bag. Can I just be an ape, please? Like, I'm not trying to be, I like, in other words, it does seem like what it requires is some kind of inhuman, superhuman preservation of consciousness despite all of human suffering and the vicissitudes of history. It seems like, can we keep on track even though humans are going to be thrown off track?
Yeah, right? I don't know. I feel like maybe what it requires is that we like, get a sense of ourselves and stop fantasizing about these gods that are going to come in and be,
No, I know. And it was a fantasy, but I just
right. No, I know. I'm not trying to knock you down. I'm just saying, like,
weird fantasy.
I have the same look. I wrote a whole book about an AI that did that, right? And it's right behind me. And it's worth noting that it came out as a dystopia, but and
it would. I mean, I guess it would, and And the interesting thing about that show, though, is that the success of the AI generates a rebellion against the AI.
Right. It does. And then
Right?
right. Yeah.
And then it's unclear whether they're the good guys or the bad guys.
Yeah. Here's what I think is that one of the tasks that we should be trying to accomplish on the left right now is the task of creating a kind of forgiving humanism on the left, where we should try to create
Freud's
a culture.
for that.
Huh?
Freud's helpful for that.
Yeah, like we should create a understanding that people are kind of frail, that they're unconsciously motivated, including that we are too. We should always take a moment to like question our own motivations when we are pressed to, and be forgiving of one another's frailties, and try to and develop a sense of humor about.
Certainly we could need it. I mean, look, we definitely need a fucking sense of humor. I mean, the thing is, I was talking to Spencer about this, Spencer Leonard, and I was like, fuck Marx, man. Like, he infected my brain, and he's this like terrible guy who did this to me, made me waste my life,
Right.
And but again, I can have a sense of humor about that. Right. But also see the kind of tragedy in it.
Mm-hmm.
And and the madness of it, and but also so I'm very suspicious of turning it into a reasonable proposition, because I'm not sure that any attempt to change society at a global scale can be turned into a reasonable proposition, meaning it's got to be dangerous utopianism. But it's either that or some like capitalist utopianism, which is equally dangerous and which to my mind is much less well thought out. Right. Like,
I tell you what, whenever I start to feel like, maybe this Marxism thing is just pie in the sky and I don't understand it well enough anyway. And
but there's the shit sandwich in the sky that we're going to get instead.
Right. Like all I have to do is remind myself that we are seriously talking about war with China right now. Like we're, I mean,
Russia, China,
Russia and China again,
fucking nukes
again. When after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, after Fukuyama, we're gonna have a fucking possibly world war again, and you try to find a real rhyme or reason to it that isn't some particular squabble somewhere in the world, that isn't like a duke getting assassinated. It's just it's on that level.
Like I've been watching, I watch Fox News pretty religiously, and so they've just been banging the drums on the fucking balloon. Right? Like they're just like, shoot it down, shoot it down, shoot it down. And and I was just like, I'm sure that the Pentagon and Biden have very good reason not to shoot it down. And
well, they did finally.
Right, they did shoot it down, but I'm like, they're probably collecting more data from the Chinese spy balloon than the spy balloon was collecting about the United States. In other words, by letting it operate, they're observing the state of the art of Chinese spy technology. So they know exactly what the fuck they're doing, right? I'm willing to say that. I'm willing to grant particular reason within the overall unreason of it. Right. But, I mean, it is kind of amazing that, you could hype up the population, or at least some portion of it, to demand, like, action be taken that might be taken to be a provocation, And it's like, what? So they turn it into, it's Biden's weak and the Pentagon are pussies and they're afraid to shoot down the balloon. I'm like, they're not afraid to shoot down the balloon. They're afraid of angering China because they're in the pocket of China or something, or they're soft on China. And I'm like, nah, it's not like that, right? There's a lot of irrationality in the world, but it's not like that. And yet people can feel, and they can be made to feel, they can be manipulated.
Oh, no, I know. It will be very easy to get people to feel as though there's an American way of life that has to be defended against the Chinese and Russian aggressors. Hell, I understand it. I would rather live in the United States than China. Okay.
So would 99% of the Chinese.
I know, right? Yeah, right. But the point is that we fucking have the Cold War ended. We are not at war as a planet anymore. That was the whole point of a neoliberal experiment. That was the whole point of, not the only point, but we were supposed to be struggling for egalitarian relationships amongst the countries based on productive
And we
trade.
are. We're doing it the best we can. It's going to take some time. And, if only the Trump bozos or the Tea Partiers don't slow us down too much, I'll channel my inner Hillary.
Oh God, I know, but it's not the.
It's all going according to plan, Doug. If only those horrible right wingers, those irredeemable deplorables and racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, what have you, if only they would just sit down and be quiet, it's all going to work out.
Yeah. It's not, that might have, if Trump had been reelected and we were in this position, that might have have flown for half a second, but with even me, but no, this is all the liberal progressives that are bringing us to the cusp of nuclear war.
Yeah, you can make the other argument. You can make the argument that they're testing Biden more than they would have. They're, that both Russia and China are pushing the envelope. They sense weakness or something. They would have been afraid of Trump because Trump was a loose cannon. And I don't know,
I don't know either, but you know what? I don't know. My guess is that Trump would have
they do more, all these countries do more provocations when the Democrats are in power. They do.
Yeah. Right. But I think Trump would have said, okay, look, why should we be in charge of everyone's security in Europe? And what has the Ukraine done for us? We're not going to just.
Oh, yeah.
We're not going to send you weapons when you haven't even helped me get rid of Hunter. No, and it would have been seen as a brutality, but it would have actually been in the interest of containing a threat. And Biden and the liberals are in this weak way, saying
it's the worst of both worlds.
Yeah,
it's the worst.
Refusing to actually negotiate anything.
It's
with
antagonistic
Russia.
And weak.
Yeah, Biden before the invasion said, "Well, we hope Russia doesn't do anything." Of course, we wouldn't do anything if they did. But we won't negotiate.
The reasons for this are not really psychological. In other words, they are structural. And, it is like the blob, and it is some kind of weird bureaucratic decision-making, that isn't quite up to snuff, that doesn't quite, this kind of micromanaging of things, that has a logic of its own. And that is, World War I, by the way, it's not like the world, obviously people think that we're more rational now than in 1914.
Oh, I don't see why.
We are not.
Why would they think that?
Not at all. In other words, they also had their kind of, elaborate way of handling things and micromanaging that just.
Oh, you mean people think we're more rationalized now than we were in 1914? Yeah. And that isn't true either.
That is not
true. What happened was we had all these treaties and contracts with these nations that accidentally, like a set of dominoes, went off.
To keep the peace instead it triggered the war.
Right, exactly.
And so that again, that kind of thinking about society and again, Lukács kind of means ends reversal, bureaucratic rationality that's actually an irrationality. Mm-hmm. Those things all apply. In other words, all of that is sort of prior to Marxism. In other words, Marxism can give you a sense of the overarching historical circumstance in which these things happen.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also more discrete things that it's going to seem hard pressed to give a particularly Marxist explanation.
Mm-hmm.
You could just say, well, in a situation of capitalism in which we think we're using capital for our purposes, but we're actually enslaved by
it. Yeah.
Right. Then other things follow. But all of those things are going to appear rational in and of themselves.
Yeah. And that's what we are dealing with right now. But I feel like everyday kind of common sense should kick in and people should say, no, all together. But
when everyday common sense kicks in, then unfortunately they have other cockamamie explanations. In other words, they can say, oh, it's like greed, consumerism, it's some kind of Western patriarchal attitude towards nature. There are all sorts of other things that fill the gap as to why we're blind as a society.
Right.
It's going to be white supremacy. It's going to be some transphobia. It's going to be some whatever.
We're risking nuclear war with Russia because of white supremacy. Oh, I don't see how that makes any sense. Both sides are claiming to fight against white supremacy.
Toxic masculinity at the very least.
Okay, toxic masculinity.